Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amy Carvales, and I'm excited to introduce the ninth program in the series, The Political Mandate of the Arts, organized by the Student Council and presented in partnership with the Venda Museum, the Thomas Mann House, and Dove Lab Radio. The Student Council consists of a team of high school, undergraduate, and graduate students who invite prominent guest speakers to discuss topics relating to art, culture, politics, and society. In conversation with visual artists, musicians, dancers, writers, theater and filmmakers, cultural critics, curators, and others, the students explore how the arts can make a difference in times of social and political crisis, on what social issues they can give new impulses, how they can help shape local communities, and how the alleged freedom and autonomy of the arts might impede or help the arts in terms of social and political significance. We warmly welcome our viewers on Zoom as well as our listeners. Today's interview will be conducted by council members Natalie McDonald, Emma Larson, Zora Nelson, and myself. We are very happy to welcome Sasha Razor as this month's guest speaker. Sasha Razor is currently a lecturer in Germanic and Slavic Studies and Film and Media Studies at UC Santa Barbara. She earned her PhD in Slavic Languages and Literature at UCLA in 2020, and she plays a significant role within events held by the UCLA Slavic Department. Razor also co-founded the Russophone Los Angeles Research Collective, an organization dedicated to researching and preserving all sorts of traces of Russophone immigration to Southern California. Their diverse collection currently spans the past 100 years. Her talents further include journalism and museum curation. Today's program will start with a 45-minute discussion moderated by Natalie, followed by 15 minutes of a Q&A with the audience chaired by Zora. Please feel free to put your questions under the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen as the interview progresses. Please keep your thoughts short and concise, no more than 1 or 2 sentences, and 1 question at a time. Your questions can be submitted at any point during the program. We also would like to thank Susan Horowitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting on-site and online discussion series at the Venda Museum. Now, Natalie will begin our discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy and Sasha. Thank you again for joining us. We're so happy to have you here. We were so intrigued to learn about your work, especially the establishment of the Russophone Los Angeles Research Collective. And I'd like to ask Emma to begin our conversation with a question about that.
So hello.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Go ahead, Sasha.
No, I just wanted to say thank you for the introduction. You know, it's very nice to be here, and thank you to the Venda Museum and Thomas Mann House for hosting this event.
Thank you so much for being here. I mean, we feel very lucky that we get to ask you these questions. Yeah, so my question has to do with your work with the Russophone Los Angeles Research Collective. It was founded in 2020 with the aim to, quote, collect, preserve, research, and popularize the rich history of Russophone migration to Southern California. And I think this is a really, really interesting project. As someone who's studied Russian history and Russian language in undergrad, I actually did not know that there was a community, a big Russophone community in Los Angeles. But I'm curious, what inspired you and your co-founder to start the program in 2020, which was, you know, with COVID, it was a pretty tumultuous year for all of us. And secondly, how has your work with the collective changed since the invasion of Ukraine last February?
Thank you for your question. So it started a little bit earlier. In 2019, I received a grant from the city of West Hollywood to produce an exhibition which would feature Russian heritage. And this is for a small festival which they run in West Hollywood, which is now called Wyho Mishka Festival. And they had to rebrand the name precisely because of the war in Ukraine. And this is when I met my collaborator and my colleague, Ivan Podvalov, who's already done a lot of work in rescuing the heritage and preserving the heritage of Russian immigrants for Los Angeles who are associated mainly with the first and second waves of migration. And it made sense for us to join efforts, and we've been working together ever since. Now that you mentioned the year 2020, it's an interesting year because I just got my PhD. And with that came the loss of library access, UCLA library access, and just to explain that as a scholar, I lived in those digital libraries and archives, and I couldn't imagine my life without, being able to continue writing and research. And that forced me to think creatively, to think outside of the box and think what kind of archives are here locally available in Los Angeles. And I started searching, and the very first archive which I happened to find was right in my neighborhood in Laurel Canyon in Los Angeles. And this is an archive of the Cossack horse trick riders, because one of them lived right next to Jim Morrison's house. And it was in a perfect pristine condition, and the person who owned it, he moved out of the neighborhood by then, but he was still very much a part of the Laurel Canyon scene. So he was very thrilled to share his knowledge and his heritage. And this was the first person we started working with. And we did a small programming event with Mike Protsenko. And then we also tried to publish as much as possible based on those materials. So this was our first experience. And we had several experiences like that, where we would call someone up randomly, find a post online pertaining to something locally, and people are on a lockdown, bored, and everyone was eager to talk and share their family stories. So this is how a more intense and serious work began. Oh, and the question was about the war with Ukraine. So migration from the Russian Empire to California has never been a homogeneous thing, and Russian was a misnomer for a long time for a very diverse group of people. So we decided to rebrand it as Russophone or Russian speaking. But if we want to be completely accurate, we have to say that this is a very wide migration from the former Russian Empire, which includes very diverse groups.
One of the things that struck me, Sasha, about your interview about the Russophone Research Collective was this idea of archival activism. And I'd like Zora to invite Zora to ask a question about this.
Thank you. Yes, of course. I'd love to. As Natalie said in your interview with the Russophone Los Angeles Research Collective, you brought up your work within archival activism. And I personally wanted to hear your opinions on the roles, relationships, and responsibilities between the curator and the audience with regard to archival activism.
Well, thank you, Zora, for your question. And you see, what archival activism is when major institutions do not preserve a certain group or do not work extensively with their heritage. Some sort of community initiatives would emerge. And whereas the museum or library curator works with a neatly organized archive, and their roles and responsibilities to maintain the collection and make sure it is up to date and presented to the audience, we find ourselves in a very different situation because it is a self-funded volunteer initiative. So we act as the intermediaries between the public and other institutions that can house the collection. So for me, it is often identifying what it is that people have. It works very much as a community network, because people by now know that Ivan Podvalov, my colleague, and me, we work with this stuff, and they reach out and say, if you're interested, I have this, this, and that. And then for me, it would be also the work of identifying the stakeholders and institutions that would be interested in these materials and finding homes for these archives, because unfortunately our collection cannot house everything. However, we are very active in building certain thematic collections, and by now we have amassed a lot that concerns amateur Russian theaters in Los Angeles, for example. I'm building a second collection that has to do with restaurants, restaurant menus, and cookbooks that pertain to Russian immigration in Los Angeles. And there are a couple of more collections like that we are very proactive in shaping and organizing.
It's wonderful to reflect upon how Emma brought up this moment, this founding moment for the collective during COVID, and how it was really this kind of serendipitous finding collections locally when we weren't able to look further afield, and how that's evolved into this kind of community outreach effort out of this moment when community was kind of so hard to locate. So thinking about research as a communal community building process, I think is really inspiring. Just a follow-up to Zora's question. I guess I'm wondering, Sasha, do you consider yourself an archival activist? And if so, how did that inform your decision to make your exhibit, The Code of Presence, Belarusian Protest Embroideries and Textile Patterns, a digital and therefore presumably more accessible exhibition?
So I do not necessarily frame myself as archival activism, but a lot of my work had to do with activism because of the protests that started in Belarus, and it was a defining momentum. Like ever since I got my PhD, first it was the BLM, the COVID, then Belarusian uprising, and now the war. So there was not one moment of peace. And in these transitional moments, academic people step up and speak on public platforms and try to highlight important narratives and important voices. So I think that academic work is no longer disengaged from public work, and this kind of came together for me. So these are two very different projects. History of Russian Los Angeles, or Russophone Los Angeles, with a very large population, and this is local history and a micro-history in its essence. As to Belarus, what we've seen is the rise of imaginative digital activism and a lot of unstable media popping up here and there, and Belarusian protest was artistic, and there was a lot of art circulated online by professional and non-professional artists alike, and institutions have been fantastic about stepping up and documenting it, and there were several online digital archives launched at the time, one by the Ivy League schools and the second one by Berkeley. And I was in touch with the librarians at the time, and I knew about their work. And it was very important for me that this material is harvested digitally and some of it is preserved. And talking about the ethics and responsibilities, these librarians are really heroes, and they're aware of the harm that it can cause to people, and they know exactly what to keep open and what to forget sometimes. But I was looking at my own community of Belarusian art workers because I have very close ties to them ever since I left Belarus. And I understood that not only the protest art is important, but our critical infrastructure is in danger because websites, even under normal condition, their lifespan is not too long, and websites die and disappear quite often. And contemporary art lives online these days, so losing a corpus is very easy. And Belarus represents a type of a country where it's 9.5 million people. Contemporary art scene is significant but not vast or immense, and it's easy to document. So huge shout out to the University of Michigan librarians, whom I convinced that we can harvest all the websites that have to do with contemporary art and preserving this community as such. And what it is we just track and get information from the websites, which actually function as community archives and initiatives by artists and activists that exist worldwide. But at the same time, while browsing online, I saw certain clusters and patterns in the type of art which was expressing the protest, and I've noticed a big deal of textile art, and this is how this exhibition came about, because I just saw that there was a distinct corpus of art which I didn't see anywhere else, and it was interesting to me. So this is it in a nutshell.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I think as a student who's hoping to be a public historian one day, it's so inspiring to see this thread kind of connecting your work. As you said earlier, given the conflict, the crisis that did ensue immediately following your finishing up your PhD, this idea of academic work having to be relevant and having to be public facing, and seeing that connect your different projects is really, really inspiring. Just for our listeners tuning in on Dub Lab Radio, we are speaking with Sasha Razor, a lecturer in Germanic and Slavic Studies and Film and Media Studies at UC Santa Barbara. Sasha, I'd like to continue talking about your digital exhibition, The Code of Presence, and I'd like to invite Amy to ask a question about the craftivist movement.
Yes, I noticed there was a portion about the craftivist movement within the exhibition. My question was, do you think the overall creation of the protest textiles still would have occurred if there wasn't the presence of this authoritarian regime? As in, do you think the political regime was the cause of this type of art creation, where people ended up, creatively making art with items that they see in their daily life and that they have memories with?
So it's a very interesting question, Amy, and I actually do not have the answer. My work mainly has to do with professional artists, and Belarusian art scene is interesting because it developed in contact with what is happening in Western contemporary art, but also has its own specificity and doesn't quite fit. And the textile art has been, on all major art exhibitions all around the world for at least the last 10 years and more. And I think for more than a decade. So this was very much a contemporary medium to engage with and work with. And I think that this was very consciously developed as a strategy by the Central Contemporary Art Platform at the time in Belarus. The gallery, which was called Uniskladova, a very specific letter of Belarusian alphabet. And this was a project which was developed by 4 major curators that came together and said that right now for our community recomposition, we need to put everyone together and let's embroider the protest and what we see. And by launching it at that platform, it stayed on, and these narratives, they persisted.
I'm struck, Amy, just a quick response, but the question, what came first? Would the art have existed without the protests and the authoritarian government? Reminds me of would the emphasis on local archives exist if we didn't have all of these factors taking us away? I mean, something that I'm really interested in currently studying is how the war in Ukraine is, giving historians and political scientists opportunities to look beyond the borders of Russia. And yeah, I think that authoritarian governments and war and coronavirus obviously are awful things, but it has been really inspiring to see the ways that those movements have been co-opted by, forces trying to do something productive for humanity.
Absolutely. It also comes down to the question whether any art trend or phenomenon can exist outside of the frame and context, or does this context always inform the narrative and what is happening? And in this case, this is, very clearly a curatorial effort that caught on. And again, it was me seeing different types of work and relating and putting them together under one cover or on one platform together. And had it been not for that, this thing would have been dispersed and remained a community knowledge.
And I think that along the lines that Emma raised, this idea of an impetus to remember and archives in moments of crisis is something that's really interesting, and I think that we're seeing a lot of. Emma, I'd actually like to invite you to ask a question about kind of building upon this idea of artwork and protest and potentially the safety provided by protest art.
Yes, in the abstract to an academic paper that you wrote called The Code of Presence that goes along with the digital art exhibition, you suggest that art is, quote, a safer way to express dissent in a dictatorial society. And I was curious if you think that the relative safety, safety in quotation marks, but safety provided by protest art, both in the context of democratic opposition forces in Belarus, but also protest art more broadly, does that sense of safety yield the same results as maybe more unsafe forms of protests, like taking to the streets? What is the role of protest art when it seems so kind of indirect to the things that you're fighting for or against?
So I would say that there are different stages of the protest, and by now, of course, this uprising has been completely crushed and dead. So when you protest in the United States, and we've seen two recent examples of the student strike and the Hollywood writers' strike, what strikes me is that it's very unimaginative. You see a group of people marching with exactly the same posters, walking in circles, and suddenly they manage to negotiate something and improve their condition from within. And the reason why this happens in a Western democratic society is because it operates under certain conventions, you know. So for the Belarusians at the time, you see a lot of art activism, digital activism, imaginative activism coming up because, you know, people are looking for the new forms to be heard, and these very traditional Western forms simply do not work, and the conventions are not there. So there is no way to negotiate it in a more, you know, reasonable way. And again, art cannot stop bullets, and the responsibility of the artist is to work safely under the new conditions when the protest, you know, is at a different stage. So right now, this is more about community recomposition because most people migrated out of the country, and many artists find themselves in exile and a state of homelessness. And I don't know if you know, but Belarusian citizens have been there is a new development. It looks like Belarusian citizens who are abroad will lose their passports very soon and become stateless people. So there is many pressing concerns, and this sort of, you know, ability to get together, embroider, work with a textile medium also has a therapeutic function.
That's fascinating about the therapeutic function. I think along those lines about kind of the flexibility of artwork, maybe, especially in times of crisis. I'd like to invite Amy to ask a question about what we even can consider art. So Amy, please go ahead.
Thank you, Natalie. Yes, my next question is still in relation to the digital exhibition. Within the introduction, there was a sentence stating that the exhibition involves materials that are, a quote, often described as traditional women's practices or craft, and that they're often excluded from these institutional art hierarchies, which I thought was pretty true when I first read the introduction. And then later on, there's an embroidered cloth with the statement, it was in Russian, but translated, it says, yes, this is normal art. So I was just thinking more broadly, who do you think defines and categorizes whether something is art or not? Do you think it's the artist and the creator, or is it the audience looking at it?
So historically, it has been, you know, the art historians and collectors and people who manage art who define it. But if you had to look at contemporary art exhibitions and their trends, the boundary between art and non-art is very blurry, and it all depends on the context these days, what is art and what is not. And it could be something that doesn't come across as art in the beginning, but once remediated into the art institution context, it functions as such. And one of my favorite examples is a Belarusian art collective called EEEFFF, who took a very interesting kind of, you know, like it's like a little poster that teaches you how to disrupt the rail system, because there were rail partisans in Belarus during the invasion of Ukraine, and they went out and they stopped the movement of Russian freight train to Ukraine. So cut them off the supplies for little bit. So they exhibit, for example, this as an artwork at major European exhibitions, and this is a very simple, very effective protest technique, very low tech, that becomes art and functions as art in a new context. So here you go.
And I guess that makes me wonder, specifically this, I hadn't encountered craftivism before reading your work, Sasha, and was so intrigued to learn about this movement. And I'm wondering, in your historical research, have you encountered any activism that might be considered, even if we didn't use this term, a movement that might be considered an early manifestation of craftivism, where art is being used in this kind of protest function?
Yeah, so I just want to have a very quick remark. We should be careful with the term craftivism because this is clearly, something invented in the US, and textile art and crisis textiles is a broader category. So I usually ask the artists themselves, how do they define it? Had they known about craftivism before? And do not inscribe them on something that they, don't want to be called. It's very important to ask the artist. So I think that some sort of manifestation of social function of textile and embroidery existed probably as long as the medium existed itself, and embroidery is a late Neolithic development. But one of the early examples I'm very curious about myself is something that textile that we can see appearing in the refugee camps and the displaced persons camps during World War II, in the Stalin Gulag. One of my favorite textile works is a ritual towel embroidered by, it's a collective embroidery by Ukrainian women, where each made a little pattern that was specific to their region and came together to the community to kind of tell this story. So works like that exist. And also embroidery is political, but does not necessarily have to protest something. Sometimes it's totalitarian political embroidery too, with many different countries, and Belarus above all embroidering, the portraits of Joseph Stalin, for example, and women of the collective farms coming together to do that. So the medium can be used in a variety of ways that suggest social and political implication, but early manifestations are absolutely important and are there to look at.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think in addition to thinking temporally, I think Zora also is curious about maybe wider spatial manifestations of protest artwork. So Zora, I'd love to invite you to ask your question.
Yeah, so of course, to continue discussing your digital exhibition, The Code of Presence, firstly, I wanted to say that I thought it was nothing short of like enlightening, inspiring, and of course, like very vivid and beautiful. And I was fascinated by this, like, I guess at face value, like seemingly like unconventional, but evidently powerful form of protest. And me myself being interested in different like artistic protest methods around the globe, I was curious if there are any other unique protest movements you've researched in Eastern Europe or beyond.
Thank you, Zora. And it's a bit of a wide question. I want to highlight perhaps one thing, and this is the new collective from Belarus as well, called Coalition of Culture Workers in Solidarity with Ukraine. And what it is a digital platform which is used for collecting anti-war art, specifically video art, in which many countries participate. And it's a very interesting phenomenon to me because it is funded by 7 curators, and 5 of them are exiles from Belarus and 2 are Ukrainian curators. And by now it has video artwork by about artists from 70 countries. And the way that it came about is my friends wanted to organize an alternative pavilion in the Venice Biennale, because they thought that the Belarusian government would have their own pavilion and they wanted to protest that. And then they found out that there'll be no Belarusian pavilion, and they already gathered some money and they wanted to do something very kind of fun and cosmic. It was a platform called Drozdovich TV, Drozdovich being a very famous artist from Belarus who worked on cosmic themes. And then the war started and they already had the money. And think about it, these are the refugees and people who are surviving themselves in Europe, but they decided to launch an anti-war platform and highlight the anti-war voices. It was launched more than a year ago, and by now it was presented at all major European exhibitions, such as European Pavilion, Documenta, Manifesta. And to me, this is a very inspiring example of what a few people can do to unite and to disseminate anti-war messages in contemporary art. So this group really dreams about exhibiting this video installation in public spaces and taking art to the people and functioning as people who presented art spaces, but also delivering this art to the common people. And to me, this is the biggest inspiration right now, and the group I want to closely work with.
I have a question about their project and also just like the digitization in general. Something that I really like about textiles is that they feel so much more physical than like the painting does. And I'm curious if like, obviously the digitization allows there to be like a broader spread, but does it maybe take something away from the fact that like it's a fabric that could be used to do something else? How does the physicality of textiles intersect with this emphasis on digitization?
So that's a great question, because it has to do with the haptic qualities of textiles. And I think this exhibition has to be real and exist on a real platform and feature some older traditional textiles and the rituals that are associated with it, along with this newer work, which exists both in digital and physical realms. But when we think about embroidery and its social function, it is a bit wider than just this physical or material quality. We can talk about the social aspects of embroidery, because when people get together to do that, they talk, there is communicative function. There is also the labor aspect, because this is something usually performed for women who don't get paid for that. It's a traditional practice, etc., etc. So many artists actually try to get away from. There is one project which I absolutely love, launched by Belarusian artist Lesia Pcholka, where she started a Telegram channel in which activists from all over former Soviet Union, the post-Soviet countries organize. They meet on Zoom and they just do their needlework and talk about their lives. And the needlework is never even in the picture. No one knows what it is that they're doing. And she created during the Belarusian protests, and she was very much inspired by activism. Her work has been informed by that, but now it's a living and breathing thing, and they meet without her, and it's like an activist. It functions as an activist rehab in a way. So again, I think digital technology really helps here in this particular case. And it is programmatic for her not to exhibit the result, just the conversations, just the process, what it is that they're talking about during this time.
Wonderful, thank you. Again, for our listeners tuning in on Dub Lab Radio, we're speaking with Sasha Razor, a lecturer in Germanic and Slavic Studies and Film and Media Studies at UC Santa Barbara. We've been speaking about the Russophone Los Angeles Research Collective, of which Sasha is a co-founder, as well as her research on protest artwork and her digital exhibition, The Code of Presence, Belarusian Protest Embroideries and Textile Patterns. Sasha, I'd like to pivot the conversation a little bit to your academic research on Soviet screenwriters. And I know Emma has a question about that. So Emma, go ahead.
Yeah, because you seem to have entered this field from like a very different perspective, which is focusing on the 1920s and avant-garde Soviet film. Now that you're working on more contemporary issues, I'm curious if you draw connections between the radical artistic movements of the early Soviet period and more contemporary manifestations of protest art. I think that question can be like seen in the context of a lot of the protests that are maybe originating today have some of their roots in the Soviet era, which may be connected to what in the 1920s people were protesting against, or maybe what they were advocating for?
So I would probably just separate the most recent protest art, because there are many different kinds of revolutions and protests, and they all have their unique characteristics. But we can talk about the socially engaged art which emerged in the region, entire region, in kind of, around 2006, 2007 and later. Those movements have a lot in common with the Russian avant-garde. I'm a bit hesitant to apply the term third avant-garde, which was suggested just in passing in one of the interviews by a Berkeley sociologist, Alexei Yurchak. I'm still not sure what to call it, but what we see is the rise of socially engaged art, performance art, interesting projects, and people are vested intellectually into the earlier forms of avant-garde. And here, let me give you some examples. I'm thinking about something like a group Party of the Dead from St. Petersburg, Партия мертвых, who, took up the dead as the group they would like to represent. I'm very much inspired, or something like НИИ ничего делать. So it's abbreviation for Research Institute of Doing Nothing, who are very much inspired by the movement of Nичегоки. There are people who absolutely into Russian Cosmism and do these things. So these ideas are very much alive and circulating, and we can see parallels in different post-Soviet countries.
And continuing on your research on film and media, and these wonderful intersections between all your research, I think Zora has a question about what inspired you to pursue the academic trajectory you have. So go ahead, Zora.
Yes, I'm very eager to know actually what inspired you to specialize in film and media studies in conjunction with your Germanic and Slavic studies, and how often you find yourself able to intersect the two fields within your career.
So great question again. I think I wanted to work on the avant-garde ever since I was 15 and 16. And this happened because many books were published at the time when I was growing up in Belarus, and just finding them and reading for the first time Velimir Khlevnikov, Daniel Harms, that was it for me, and this was for life. And I knew that I wanted to work with this material somehow, but I also had to do something new. And living in Los Angeles, in Laurel Canyon, surrounded by screenwriters, it was just a very natural thing to look at how those people worked in the film industry. And this is what my dissertation is about. Now, the question is about combining two disciplines, regional studies, which Slavic studies are, and film and media studies. I would say that the subjects intersect, and it is not unusual for regional studies to have film scholars teach and work there, but the methodologies are quite different between, film and media studies, and how regional studies department work, because this goes for everyone, like Germans, Italians, French, they treat film courses as the entryway into the culture and enrollment and all of that, whereas film and media studies have a very distinct methodologies, methods of working, and the two do not always overlap. So sometimes there are courses like Russian history through film. And my question is, can you really study Russian history through film? Because film is a manipulative medium. So if you base your notion of history on, what you see on screen, produced by very social and politically engaged filmmakers, which version of history are we talking about? For example, the most iconic, and this is my favorite example, the most iconic scene in Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin is the Potemkin stairs, and there is a great episode with baby carriage and the protests happening on those steps. So that never happened in real life. And during the mutiny, the steps were closed off. People were not there. This is Eisenstein's invention, which became iconic and informs our understanding of the events of 1905 in Odessa for many, many generations of viewers. So there are things like that that I constantly have to negotiate in my career and reflect in my syllabi and teach my students about it.
And I guess that reminds me of something you brought up in that June 2022 interview. You say that studying Russophone immigration presents a quote, alternative history of the Russian Empire. And as a student of history, I'm intrigued and curious about your thoughts. Like, why is it important to recover alternative histories?
Let me give you just one example. Right now, we are living through a massive wave of migration from the Russian Federation, and people arrive in Los Angeles daily, and there are many of them. And this is the community that still remains invisible by and large. But when they hold meetings in support of Navalny, Alexei Navalny, for example, we see more than 1,000 people show up, and those are all new faces whom I do not know. So I've been consistently talking to refugees from the Russian Federation, asking why is it that you guys do not organize and help others and build your organizations and diasporas? Why this lack of visibility? Why this lack of organization? And the answers vary, but it all comes down to Russia being too big and they don't identify with immigrants from other regions and socioeconomic groups, or that, Russians don't like see other Russians abroad. I get a number of answers and I write them down. Actually, I have a collection. But if you are to look at the Russian and at the immigration from the Russian Empire in the 1920s and 1940s, you see gazillion of organizations, unions, and support groups which were built instantly and mushroomed all over Los Angeles. So the question is, how come that it's the same territory, obviously different people living on the same territory, speaking slightly different versions of Russian, form two very different and very distinct waves? And I think there is a lot of value at looking what white emigres have done in the city and how they lived and the current organizations, because there is you would think that it would be very conservative and monarchical and what have you, but they actually support Ukraine, and this is like right on their website, or they help children who are in need regardless of the nationality because they went through the refugee trauma themselves. So I think that uniting these different narratives and presenting them to the public will be very beneficial for people who come from Russia these days too, because they can draw inspiration and learn different strategies of survival.
Absolutely. This has been such a wonderful conversation covering protest embroidery, archival practice, archival activism, the Soviet avant-garde film. So I do want to remind our viewers, if you have questions, please do share them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will be transitioning to the Q&A portion of our program momentarily. So again, please, viewers, do feel free to share your questions. To wrap up our conversation before moving on to the Q&A, I'd like to invite Amy to ask a question that I think really brings together a lot of the threads we've been discussing so far this evening. So Amy, please share your question about the Russophone LA Research Collective and community and diasporic work.
Thank you. Yeah, my last question, it is about the Russophone Collective. And we often think of art as, as individual task, which is, true in the sense that no two artists are ever going to be the same. So in relation to the collective, which is a lot community-based and diasporic-based, and you touched upon it a little bit just now, what do you think is the most unique aspect about this collective art? Because it comes from the community, it's very local, it's archival, in relation to just individual art? Like, what makes it so special in comparison to just what one person creates, as opposed to something that you found over time, or even just now as you're talking to them daily? But what is so special, what's so unique about the work you're doing with the collective?
So thank you, Amy. And I have to say that our work is research-based, and right now we see a lot of intersections between researchers and artists and research-based art emerging, but we are not quite there with the artwork. What we do is we, collect archives, participate in archival fairs, run small programming, and try to do write-ups on it and get the stories, make the stories public and well known. But the dynamic is essentially the same, because in any art group, the question of collaboration, its rules and boundaries is the one that is pertinent. And for some people, it's been very programmatic to stand as one, be anonymous, and create the work in which you will never get individual credit or the fame, just the collective. And for others, we've seen all different situations. So the nature of my collaboration with my colleagues, Ivan Podvalov and also Lian Shrimer, it's really loose, and it's based on our individual interests. And we are very much open to invite other researchers. And I think that as long as you do the work in the area and you can contribute some of your labor to preservation and maybe also reviewing and peer review and works of your colleagues, this is it. And this is about the living and breathing community engagement at its best. So.
Well, I think that's a perfect note with which to conclude this portion of the program. Thank you so much, Sasha, for our listeners tuning in via DubLab. Again, this is the Venda Museum and Thomas Mann House Student Council. We're speaking with Sasha Razor, a lecturer in Germanic and Slavic Studies and Film and Media Studies at UC Santa Barbara. And I'm now going to hand off the conversation to Zora Nelson, a fellow member of the Student Council, who will be moderating the Q&A.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you, of course, Sasha, so much for such a thorough conversation. To move on to the Q&A, our first question is from Vladimir, who asks, what can you say about the Russian-speaking community in LA specifically in regards to the number, composition, social structure, political views, and so on?
So Russian community in Los Angeles is not homogeneous, and it's been shaped by several consecutive waves of migration. So people start coming to LA as early as the 1900s. And there are several groups who came here. First, it was the sect of the Molokhans, the sectarians who fled the persecution in the former Russian Empire, and they migrated here from such regions as Azerbaijan or Armenia, where they previously lived. The first Russian town was in Boyle Heights, and it was called historically the Beards Town. That was the unofficial name that stuck. And if you look up the images of those times, more than 100 years ago, it really looks like the Russian village in the middle of LA. The second Russian town that appeared was the so-called Hollywood's Russian colony, and that was initially just about 1,500 of people who came in the 1920s, and they settled in Hollywood. And their proximity to the Hollywood film studios enabled a very interesting phenomenon of them working as extras, and a movie extra was the most widespread job in the Hollywood Russian colony. As a film scholar, again, I'm very fascinated about it, still collecting information, and want to write at least an article on the role of the extras in the Hollywood film industry and those of Russian origin. And the third, which we can call Russian town, but not exactly though, is located right now in West Hollywood, and it's a neighborhood between Fairfax Avenue and La Brea Avenue, Santa Monica and Sunset Boulevards. So this is very much a production of the third and fourth waves of migration, Jewish exiles and refugees who came from the Soviet Union, and the Jewish community hosting and housing them initially. So this is a declining neighborhood. We do not have the exact numbers because the city of West Hollywood doesn't quite get these ethnic questions on their census. They ask, what language do you speak at home? And many people of Russian heritage speak English at home by now. So we cannot count them exactly, but it used to be as big as 25% of the population of West Hollywood. And the numbers these days are unknown, but this is an aging diasporic group. And what we know about these groups, the elders migrate and settle in this initial residential ethnic area, and then the children move out eventually. So this is, if you want to see it in Los Angeles, this is the high time to do it, because this community will look completely different in even 10 years from now. This is really the time to document it.
Thank you. We have another question from the chat from Nada Wall. She wants to know if you gathered information from the Russian Orthodox churches that were built here in LA by immigrants from the Bolshevik Revolution.
So when you study migration, and especially white immigrants to Los Angeles, churches are the first place to go, and we are working with them extensively. My colleague Ivan Podvalov even built tiny museum room in one of the churches, and this is where we hold the meetings. But the room itself is the property of the church, but we store some of our archives there. There is a small exhibition display, and this is a lovely gathering space. What's remarkable about that church in particular is that it had many famous Hollywood figures come there. So you walk in and there is a grand piano which belonged to some Gershwin, for example. This is the church where they held a funeral service for Rachmaninoff. So there is a lot of history and culture that come with that, and it's a wonderful, wonderful community to work with generally. We also do research on the history of Russian education in California. So Ivan Podvalov, I think you should be presenting with me, wrote a tiny brochure for the second Orthodox church, which we have in the area, and the history of that school. And we are now finishing the brochure, not a brochure, but like a booklet about the history of the church school that we work with. So there is many things like that going. So community schools and churches are very important to the study of the immigration and have been at the heart of it for many years.
Thank you. We have another question here, more about protest art in general, as we were discussing earlier. Do you feel that there's a difference in the impact between different artistic media forms, such as visual art, literature, film, etc., and what they can achieve in terms of protest art?
So different forms react differently, and of course visual and video art is something that gets disseminated a lot more than literature, because reading requires more effort on behalf of the audience. And during the protests itself, we had a huge discussion in the communities which pertaining to which platforms to use, because on one hand, no one is too fond of the social media platforms such as Instagram and Facebook and YouTube, which would censor you, and sometimes you would try to disseminate a very sensitive content and you violate the rules and regulations of the community, so people can attack you. So all those platforms have innate biases and algorithms that you have to work with. So this is how one of the platforms for repositories of protest posters appeared in Belarus, called kultprotest.me, where people preserve their posters, and it's all like they're completely independent, completely pristine. But by that, it lost the social momentum and became a purely art gallery and art museum platform where you can borrow these images, you can use them, but they do not get shared a lot. And people who took it to Instagram and started posting the protest art on Instagram got an instant following. And this is how I met One of my collaborators, Rufina Bazlova, and the Vanda Museum exhibited her work. So thank you, Yus, again for, highlighting and giving space to Belarusian artists in Los Angeles. So Rufina became viral overnight because what she did is she created a digital embroideries. She would use the cross-stitching techniques to depict images of the protests, which were recognizable for millions of people. And she really became one of the most important voices during this protest. And kudos to her, she continues to document very consistently what is happening to Belarus and is doing a large project right now dedicated to political prisoners in the country. So again, that use of Instagram as a platform was very effective. So we can talk about different medium, but also the platform usage and how activists and artists use them and algorithms to amplify their voices.
Thank you. And I think we have time for maybe about one more. So I have I have an interesting one here. We wanted to know, what is your favorite thing that you've found while working to gather pieces for the Russophone Los Angeles Research Collective?
I tell you what, I found this one cookbook and I suddenly became very interested and invested in the history of ethnic restaurants in Los Angeles. So I found this one cookbook, which was written in 1940s during World War II by a woman named Vanda L. Frolov. And it's really a narrative saga of Russian-speaking Los Angeles in the 1920s. And I was so curious about this cookbook that I did an entire detective search for the author, went on Ancestry, pulled all her records, and was able to piece her story together. And it happened to be an American woman who came from a very small town in Southern California, lived in Long Beach. She might have had some acquaintance with the Russian immigrants, and then she married the Russian immigrant. And she wrote this cookbook as an homage to some family friend, but it just, this intersection of childhood, migration, recipes, and narrative cookbook, it's something that blew me away, and I developed it as a research interest consequently. And this year, I don't know if you're aware, there is a such thing as LA Subject, and it is a large archival fair which happens in October at the USC. We'll be presenting a part of the collection which has to do with historic restaurant menus and recipes and the local Los Angeles life. So that was unexpected, and that was something that genuinely emerged from the materials that I saw and not my previous research interests.
Thank you. That's super cool. Thank you for seeing that with us. And once again, Sasha, just in general, thank you for such an engaging, enlightening conversation, of course. I'd like to conclude the program by announcing our new guest for Wednesday, October 25th, is Vietnamese-American filmmaker and producer Elizabeth Ai. So thank you, everybody.